Okay, so we're recording now, and this should be live to Facebook, so we'll just wait to get a confirmation. Oh, cool. I can see us. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. And the first thing I want to ask you is just a brief introduction. So tell us about yourself and how you kind of got to where you are currently as the Vice President of WILD.
Thanks, Savannah. So I have been a long time environmentalist, and I was studying environmental policy. Actually, I was in my PhD program for environmental policy at Colorado State University, and I, was just watching what was happening in the world, and I really wanted to be out. Applying the knowledge I had and doing something versus just researching about what was being done. And when the job opened up at Wild, it was really my dream job. And it I've been able to bring a lot of my skills as both a community organizer, a marketer, and an environmental social movement theorist to the work at Wild.
Awesome. Yeah, and it's been a pleasure working with you as well. I've learned a lot thus far in the few months that I've been here. So we're going to pull up a quote from Antonio Guterres. And I'm just going to read it really quickly. Humanity is waging war on nature. This is suicidal. Air and water pollution are killing 9 million people annually, more than 6 times the current toll of the pandemic. And with people and livestock encroaching further into animal habitats and disrupting wild spaces, we could see more viruses and other diseases agents jump from animals to humans. So I'll leave that up for a second.
I just want to clarify that this quote is from Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN. And he made this statement in December of 2020. And I apologize for smiling in the middle of it. Obviously, it's serious, and I think he's incredibly accurate. And it's good to have this powerful statement from the United Nations. But I was smiling at the comments from Jay Waxy about community organizing. That's all. Savannah, are you there? Well, since Savannah is gone, I will just speak a little bit more about this. What's interesting is that Antonio Guterres, as the Secretary General of the United Nations, has made several very strong statements about humanity and our relationship with nature. And he's actually said it is the fundamental task of the next decade for us to restore and fix our relationship with nature, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because our survival depends on it. And this has become very clear in the light of the pandemic, which is essentially caused by a broken relationship with nature and the intrusion of human settlements and human civilization in wild areas.
Awesome. Yeah, I was going to ask you to show the correlation between the encroachment of wild habitat and the increased risk of disease outbreak, but it sounds
Well,
like you just answered it.
well, no, I can go into more detail actually. Over the last
Yeah.
30 years, we've seen an increase of about 30% of disease outbreaks. At the same time, we've also seen over, I think it's about a quarter of the wildlands that we had 30 years ago have vanished. And there's this is a correlation, but many scientists are increasingly coming out with research that shows it's not just a correlation, that the rise in disease outbreaks is actually caused in large part by our intrusion into wildlands. And the reason for this is that there are literally thousands of novel viruses that exist in wild animal populations around the world that we haven't encountered yet. That the areas that these creatures live in, they're not spaces we inhabit. And so when we very rapidly on a geologic scale move into these spaces and we fragment nature, so there's some wildlands around, there's some farmlands, there's some cities, we actually begin to move into areas where the wild animal populations exist that carry these viruses. And we then expose ourselves to them. And that's when you have zoonotic spillover and you get novel diseases. And so, the solution to this isn't to remove all the wildlands and wild animals, because actually there's also a correlation between high biodiversity and lower risk of novel viruses. And there are reasons for this about how high biodiversity can actually essentially dilute viruses and make it more difficult for them to spill over. Ultimately, the solution is to recognize that nature is a fortress. It's a fortress against diseases. And not only is it a fortress of life-giving services, where all of these parts inside of a wild area, from a blade of grass to a rhino to bats, all of these parts contribute to the production of oxygen in our environment, the reduction of carbon from our atmosphere, the fertility of our soils, and climate patterns, our rainfall. It also acts as a buffer, as a fortress against the rise of diseases. And we need to recognize that our health is inextricably linked with the health of nature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was well said. That leads actually quite well into my next question. In your research, which area of land, sea, or air has seen the most destruction in the last 20 years? And feel free to relate that kind of back to the pandemic and how that's affected us.
Well, it's interesting to me that we kind of treat landscapes and we treat species as somehow distinct from one another. The rainforest is rainforest and the ocean is the ocean and tigers are tigers. And we invest our passion in one or two of these things. And we forget that all of this belongs to a whole complete system that makes up this planet. And, we as a species, for whatever reason, we really value really shiny objects like gold and silver and platinum, diamonds and whatnot. But I guarantee you can go to almost any other rock in the solar system and find gold and find silver, find these minerals, these elemental minerals. But you can't go to another place in our solar system and find the biosphere we have. That is actually the rarest, most valuable thing that we have. And every single part of the biosphere contributes to our health and well-being. They are all interlinked. They all work as essentially a machine, an engine, a living machine to produce what we need. And every single part of the biosphere is under attack. And when we attack it, and when we degrade it, we degrade our own well-being and the potential for healthy lives.
Yeah. What policies? So as a scholar of environmental policy, what policies do we have in place that directly relate to climate emergency?
Well, so here's the thing is that we just as we treat the different landscapes and different species as separate from one another, and as if they were the extinction of a single species is a problem that we can address in isolation. We treat it like that, and it's not. We can't. In fact, the number one cause of extinction is not poaching, it's habitat loss. And so by saving and restoring wildlands, we're actually halting extinction in its tracks. It's the exact same thing with climate. You know, we treat climate as if it's separate somehow from nature. And we treat it as if it's something that we can engineer ourselves out of. If we just build better cars and more efficient solar panels and everything like that, like we're somehow going to solve this problem. But the fact is, we absolutely, this is a fact, we cannot meet our climate targets, keeping temperature rise under 1.5 degrees, keeping the parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere under 450. We can't do it without nature. Nature is the single biggest carbon storage we have. The oceans are the biggest, but the biggest above ground carbon storage is our boreal forests. So we can't do this without nature. And every time we remove a landscape, a boreal forest, a peat bog, we degrade parts of the ocean, we are impairing nature's ability to be our ally and to remove excess carbon from the atmosphere. And in fact, if we restore landscapes, we can actually start removing more carbon from the atmosphere. We might be able to remove almost close to 40% of the carbon that we need to remove in order to meet our Paris climate targets. So I think probably, and what's great about nature too, is it's not a technology that we have to invest in and scale up and figure out how many trillions of dollars we need in order to make it work in Africa and in Asia and everywhere around the world. It's there already. It's a solution that's already at scale, and all we have to do is help it help us. And so this is the brilliant thing, and I think it's probably the most efficient, most effective, biggest, fastest policy we can implement in order to reduce the likelihood of pandemics, stabilize climate change, and halt extinction. And that is protect nature. And if we're listening to what the scientists say, they say we have to protect at least 50% of Earth's land and seas if we're going to keep this system functioning. So that's why the Wild Foundation this year will be advocating for this solution at the IUCN World Conservation Congress, as well as the Convention on Biological Diversity. Savannah, I can't hear you. You were minimized on my screen, and now I can't hear you. I still can't hear you. But I'm gonna guess that your next question is one of the questions that you sent me beforehand. So let me look that up right now, so I can answer it for you. It looks like you were going to ask about, oh, I have to log in here. Yeah, you know, it's really interesting. I think part of the reason why the climate issue has kind of superseded the biodiversity issue is that, and this is nothing against climate, like we have to address climate change through renewable energies, through technology, along with protecting nature. But I think part of the reason why it is spoken about much more frequently than protecting biodiversity is because ultimately you can make money off of addressing climate change. Renewable energies is a profit center, and that I mean, we kind of think profit is a bad word. It's not, but you can basically create proprietary solutions to address climate change. And it's not that you can't do that with biodiversity and with wilderness. However, much of wilderness and biodiversity fall into a category that we call the commons. And the definition of the commons is that you essentially can't make money off of it. The commons belong to everybody. You can't exclude anybody from the commons. And so it's much harder to come up with solutions that are profitable for private individuals and private entities, which means we have to collectively solve this as a society. Now, in terms of your next question, you were going to ask me Can you tell us what rewilding entails and how interconnected wilderness is a benefit to humanity?
Yeah, that's exactly what I
Right.
was going to ask.
So I mentioned in my last answer that we have to protect 50% of Earth's land and seas. And we're basically at that threshold right now as a planet that we have maybe just a little bit more than 50% of our wild lands and wild seas that are intact. And this is new for our species. Never before have we lived on a planet with as little wilderness and as few wild lands and wild areas as we do now. And that's scary. There's a lot of risk involved with that. And if we don't protect what's left, the science tells us we're going to be in a whole world of hurt. But in addition to protecting what we have, we are also going to have to restore nature. And what we call the restoration of nature is rewilding. And rewilding essentially just giving nature the space it needs and the things it needs to heal itself. It's, involves a couple of major activities, from reintroducing native species, both plant and animal, to removing invasive species, restoring landscapes, and restoring watersheds. So rewilding is absolutely essential to reconnect wilderness to itself, because right now what we've essentially done is fragment wilderness so much that it impairs gene flow, it impairs water flow. There's just these little postage stamp size areas of wilderness all over the map, and they need to be reconnected through corridors that will allow wilderness to function in a more intact way. Rewilding can help us do that. Additionally, rewilding can also restore landscapes that are incredibly important carbon stabilization areas. And so we can essentially look at those landscapes on a map, look at peat bogs, look at boreal forests, see where it is that we can both interconnect them to other landscapes, and also where it is we're going to get the most carbon drawdown. And those will absolutely play an essential role in fighting the climate emergency. So hang on, let me get back to the Facebook screen, because I'm sure you're probably trying to talk to me, and I just don't see it. So
can you hear me now?
The next question on your list is, what can individuals that are watching do to help with rewilding? Well, the Saturday is the very first World Rewilding Day. And if you go to rewildingglobal.org/rewilding-day, you can learn more about that day. And there's actually a useful introductory guide to rewilding that you can download there. The World Rewilding Day is really a kickoff to this global movement of people who are already practicing rewilding, but who are now committed to working together across national boundaries and across cultures in order to create a coordinated effort to rewild nature and rewild the biosphere at the scale it needs, which is planetary. And it's an unprecedented problem, so we kind of need unprecedented coordination. And World Rewilding Day is our first stab at creating the awareness that we need to expand that movement and to maximize coordination in the future.
Okay, can you hear me now, Amy?
I can totally hear you now, Savannah.
Yay, you don't even need me here. You just did all of it. Those were lovely answers. And yeah, I only have one thing left, and that's just to open up Q&A for the audience. So if anybody in the audience has any questions, now is the time to post it in the comments if you would like. There's just 3 of you viewing right now, so not too many people. but we'll also leave this open for future questions.
I just want to get to Jay Waxy's comment about the appointment of Secretary Deborah Haaland as the Secretary of Interior, and she is the very first Native American to serve in a cabinet level position of the United States. And I have to say, this is one of the proudest moments for me as a citizen of the United States to see her rise to this position. And I have a lot of hope for what she can accomplish there. And I absolutely agree with you, Jay, about the leadership that the leadership embodied in indigenous wisdom and indigenous life ways. The Wild Foundation for over 40 years has been not only committed to working with indigenous populations, but to actually learning from them and to elevating them to the leadership roles that it is their right to occupy within the conservation movement. And in fact, one of in the very first wilderness 1B management category guidelines published at the international level, the Wild Foundation made sure to strengthen the commitment to not only working again with Native peoples, but also really learning from them and recognizing their leadership and co-leading with them in the conservation movement.
And I think you have another question here. What's our biggest obstacle preventing us from rewilding right now?
So you know what? A lot of people, like when we think of obstacles to a more sustainable and healthy planet, what we generally think of are technological problems, the technology we don't have, or the technology that we need to scale up. But in fact, we could have all the technology in the world and still not be able to achieve our environmental goals, both climate and conservation wise. And the reason for this is technology without coordination and without collaboration doesn't get used. It doesn't get, it's not dispersed to the people who need to use it. So I think that the biggest challenge we actually have is not a technological or scientific challenge, it's a social challenge. We have to learn to work together at scale across the planet with depth and integrity at a scale we've never had to do before. Our biggest coalitions oftentimes have really been limited to the national scale, and we really need a super coordinated international coalition in order to build the momentum and the capacity to rewild Earth at scale. So I would say that's the biggest obstacle right now.
Yeah, I actually have a question myself. In terms of rewilding, where do we currently stand?
Well, in terms of the remaining wilderness that's intact, like really healthy, really super wild areas, we're talking about 24% of the planet. It's not a lot. Now, there's another 25 to 26% of the planet where the landscapes are intact enough that they're still functioning. So they're not true wilderness, and that's okay because they're still functioning. We need to protect those lands, keep them at the level of functionality they're at now, and we need to add to them by rewilding. So that's kind of the state we're in at the moment. In terms of what's actually protected now, that's an inventory of actual wildlands and semi-wildlands. In terms of what's actually protected on paper, we have approximately 17% of terrestrial areas and 10% of marine areas protected. Now, many of those protections are on paper only, they're not super enforced, and we need to work on that. But we simultaneously need to expand the awareness and recognition and commitment to protect more, to protect half, so that we can assure that the 24% of wilderness that remains, as well as the 26% of other intact lands that we have, stay that way. And so that's why we're working to protect half of Earth's land and seas right now, because it's going to be far easier to protect half while we still have those areas left to protect than it will be to decades later come back and realize that we should have protected those things in the past and try to restore on a scale that is unimaginable, especially since we'll be looking at a lot of extinctions and there's some things we will not be able to restore.
Yeah. Yeah, and to anyone watching right now, we do post a lot of these articles surrounding what Amy just said through our Nature Needs Half platform. So I encourage you to give that a follow, watch our Twitter page, and read the articles posted there, because they fall in line with a lot of what she just said. We're going to do one more question, and then we'll probably call it a night. Are you up for that, Amy?
Of course.
Cool. Okay. So Cassie's question is, do you think the pandemic was enough to get us all to realize that our health is reliant on healthy nature?
It's such an interesting question, because I think for a lot of people, I mean, we've seen this recognition at the UN, and that's super positive. And there's also been numerous articles and letters that have come out from coalition of scientists that have recognized that the pandemic has been essentially directly caused by a broken relationship with nature. So there is recognition at that level. Do I think that recognition has trickled down into the mass public? Not quite. No, I don't. I think it's largely limited to conservation and to kind of an elite expert crowd. We still need to do a lot of work in order to make the public, even much of the environmental movement, largely the environmental movement that's focused on climate, aware that, you know what, nature needs protecting, and our health is linked to it. And when we protect nature, we're actually protecting ourselves.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you for answering all those questions, and thanks for giving us your time here today. So this is going to be a recorded talk, so anyone who's watching, if you want to go back and watch it again, then you can. Amy, any other things you want to say, or?
No, I'm just super appreciative for you, Savannah, for making this happen, and for everybody in the audience, both present and in the future, who are watching this. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much. Well, have a good night, Amy, and I'll see you on Slack.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.